Hey everyone, this is Tara with the Painted Cicada. Give me just a minute here and let me make sure I am broadcasting in all the right places. Want to make sure I've got it pinned at the top and all that good stuff. I don't see myself. There we go. All right, I'm going to give everybody just a few minutes here to get on to be able to find this. I will give everybody just another minute here. I am just going to change the settings. I see a few people hopping on, but it is not at the top of the group. So I don't know why it's doing that. Oh well. All right, let's see. I am just gonna post the link straight into the group and maybe that will work. Here we go. All right. If you are joining me tonight, say hi in the comments. I'm happy to have you here. Watermelon is one of my favorite summer snacks, so I'm super excited to paint this with you. And this is a really great beginner watercolor, but it's fun if you paint with watercolor frequently as well. So I am going to go ahead and get started. Hi, Cindy. I'll go over the supplies that I'm using tonight. You can use any of the supplies that you have at home. It doesn't have to be exactly what I have, but I always get a lot of questions from people about what I'm using. So I try to let everybody know that what you have is okay. Don't run out and buy stuff. But if you want to know what I have, as far as watercolor, I am using, this is Prima. It's called the Classics. It is an art philosophy brand. And this is a really great, it is student grade watercolor, but I really like it. I think that it works really well for almost everything that I do. Another brand of watercolor that I really like, if you are ready to kind of step up your game, is Dr. P.H. Martin's. Let me see if I can get this focused here. Radiant watercolor. And these run about $75 a set, so they're fairly expensive, but they're highly concentrated, they're archival, they're wonderful. So if you are a watercolor painter and you're ready to step up your game, these are fabulous. But for a lot of my art that I just keep around the house and things I make for fun, I like to use these Prima confections. They are pretty awesome. I love them. As far as paper, one of my favorite watercolor papers to use is Canson XL watercolor paper. And this is usually about $8 a pad for a 9x12. It's fairly inexpensive compared to other watercolor papers, but I really like how it performs. So that's what I'm using. And hi, Michelle. Oh, I see a lot of people. Hi, Ivy. Hi, Ethel. Yay, everybody's hopping on. As far as brushes, I'm using Royal Aqualon. I guess you can't really see. It's got, I've got a size 8 and a size 2. Basically, you want a large and a small brush. I don't think you need super expensive brushes for watercolor. This set, I think, cost me about $20. I bought a set of rounds. And I've had these for a couple years. Watercolor is very gentle on your brushes, so I don't have to replace these very often. Whereas as far as acrylics go, my acrylic brushes, I just buy cheap brushes because I have to replace them all the time. These brushes I spent a little more money on, but they have lasted a long time. Oh, I see people hopping on. Hello, Northeast Florida. I wish I was in Florida. I'm in Ohio. Kind of boring. And then you will need just a palette to put your paint on. And I use a ceramic palette. I got this on Amazon. I think it was $8. So if you're into watercolors, this is a handy thing to have, but you can certainly use, a plate. You can use anything. And then of course you're going to need water and some paper towels. All right. I am going to clear off my desk here. I'm going to show you how to do 2 types of watercolor tonight, or watermelon tonight. I'm going to get those reversed all night, watercolor and watermelon. I'm going to show you how to do these wedges of watermelon, and then we'll do kind of a full watermelon half here. Oh, Michelle, that would be so fun. I would love that. We could have an art weekend. All right. Let me move my sample out of the way here. We are going to do this in a few steps. Clear off. One thing that is super handy when you're working with watercolor is that we can speed along the drying process either with a heat gun or with a hair dryer. So if you do have one of those, that is super handy. Otherwise, watercolor doesn't take all that long to dry in between layers. So it's totally up to you. Give me just a second. I've got somebody messaging me that can't find us. Let me make sure everybody gets in. All right. There we go. Sorry about that. All right, so let's mix up our paint. And I've got all the colors I need right here, but I think I just told you to have some primaries and black available. I'm going to use a little bit of red, a little bit of pink. I'm just, when you've got watercolors in trays like this, you can I just add a couple dots of water where I want it to be. Watercolor is kind of one of those things, as long as you get the general shape, you can tell what it is. So don't stress too much. All right. The first color we're going to make is green. Now I have a pre-mixed green on here that I can use, but one of the things that I really like about watercolor is that it kind of moves and the pigment separates a little bit. So I'm going to make my green by mixing some blue and yellow. And part of the reason why I do this, and you'll see when we're working, is it just kind of blends and moves a little differently. I love it when the pigments separate, so that's what I'm kind of going for here. Of course, you can use regular green if you're not into color mixing, that's fine as well. All right, the first step that we are going to do is start with our green rind of the watermelon. So I'm going to, I do want my yellow handy. So if you have to mix or prepare your watercolor, you can pull some yellow out to the side as well. So if you've got tubes or anything like that, sometimes I like to have it ready to go. All right, so for this step, we're using green and yellow, and I made my green with blue and yellow. All right, so tap into your watercolor, and we're going to do 2 rinds, which is just kind of a semicircle. So I'm going to put one on this side and then one over here on this side. And once I get this rind down here, I'm just going to touch in my green and add a little more color. I'm going to wipe off my brush, dip it in water, and then right next to this rind, I'm going to add just another semicircle, and I'm going to touch that green, and it's going to blend out. And then what I can do is come back and maybe just add a touch of yellow here and there, just to give that some depth and variation. So let me see if I can get it where you can see my water. So I added that strip of green, and then right next to it, I went through and I added just a strip of water, and that green is going to blend out just a little bit. All right, now we want this part to dry just a little bit, but what we are going to do is we're going to mix up our watermelon color. Now, like I said, if you don't like color mixing, you can pull a red, you can just have red watermelon. You can pull a pink, you can just have pink watermelon. What I like to do is I am going to mix, I'm going to start with red as my base here. And I feel like watermelon kind of has a coral undertone. It's not quite red, it's not quite pink, it's not quite orange. So I am going to mix all 3 of these colors. So I'm going to have maybe 2 or 3 parts red. I'm going to add in maybe 1 part pink. And then I'm going to come through and maybe add 1 part orange. And I'm just going to mix that until I get a color that I like, kind of a pinkish orangish red. Again, if you are more comfortable just using a straight color from your palette, that is fine too. But I like to have this orangish red. All right, so what we're going to do, one of our watermelons, we are going to have an imaginary triangle, right? Picture what a watermelon wedge looks like. Here's my sample. And what we're going to do is fill in the tip of that wedge with our watermelon color. We want it nice and pigmented. And then what I'm going to do is dip my brush right in the water, shake it out a little bit, and then I'm going to pull this down. So that down here at the bottom, it's clean water, and I'm blending downward. Now I don't want my watermelon color to touch this rind here. So I'm going to go as close as I can without touching. If you've got some white space in your watermelon, that's fine too. And I'm just going to let that move and blend on its own. Sorry about my dogs going crazy. Happens every time I go live. All right, now I'm going to do the same thing. While this one's moving and blending, you can see how I've got it wet, and it's not so wet that it pools, but it's wet enough that it will move and blend on that paper. Yes, wet on wet would work. I'm starting with dry up here, and then I'm kind of just adding water. So for the second watermelon here, I'm going to create kind of a bite mark and blend this downward. I'm going to clean off my brush, and then I'm going to pull it down with a clean brush with water. And then again, I'm not going to touch the rind. I'm going to leave a little bit of space. And this gives the appearance of how it gets lighter the closer it gets to the rind, and it's darker in color the closer to the middle. So absolutely, you can do wet on wet. It'll just give you a slightly different effect, Ivy, and that's absolutely okay. So you can try it both ways if you want. But wet on wet would certainly work. Actually, let me grab another piece of watercolor paper. I'm glad you mentioned that. So in watercolor, there are two. I'm going to set this aside and let it dry for a moment. There are two techniques that you can use. And the first is wet on dry. And so that's when you just would take a color and you're going to put wet watercolor on dry paper, and you can see it kind of leaves a nice crisp edge. The second option for watercolor is called wet on wet, and that's where your paper is wet and you can add in color. And you can see when you do wet on wet, it just behaves a little differently. And so this is my wet on dry. And then this is where I just tapped in color. So you can definitely play with the effects by alternating these two different techniques. And so that's just a little demonstration. So when I did my watermelon, it was kind of, I started wet on dry, but then when I pulled it down, I pulled it into nice wetness. And so it was kind of a combination of both. But as you can see here, either of these, whether you did the first technique with me or whether you do wet on wet, it will make a really beautiful watermelon. So don't be afraid to play with it. I love it when people try their own techniques. All right. This dried a little bit, but I am going to zap it and just, oops, let me reorganize. I went a little AWOL with my little aside there. All right. I am going to dry this just because what we're going to do is add a little more detail in the rind, and then we're going to add some seeds, and we want it to be nice and dry for both of those parts. All right, so this is nice and dry. If yours isn't quite dry yet, that's okay. You can watch as I do it, and when yours is dry, you can go ahead and and repeat what I've done. There's certainly no right or wrong. And this is a quick lesson, so don't worry too much. I'm gonna re-wet my green here just a little bit. Now what I'm gonna do is just add a nice second layer with my thin brush on this rind, right on the edge. And I just want to have a nice dark edge. And that's just kind of representing the darkest part of that rind, that watermelon skin. Right, so that was super easy, right? The next thing we're going to do is make some seeds, and for that you're going to need black. So I'm going to pull some black out. Black is usually one of the highest pigmented colors that you have, so typically you don't need a lot of black. And this is why we wanted our watermelon to be dry for this stage. So we are going to add in some seeds. Now, when you see seeds, your watermelon seeds are kind of teardrop shaped. Now, this is a little larger than I'm going to go in my watermelon, but we want it to be kind of teardrop shaped. So if you've got a spare piece of paper, you can always practice that shape, but also know that sometimes when we look at a watermelon, right, like sometimes we just see, you know, maybe that little edge poking out. Sometimes we just see the little curved part poking out. So it's okay to include all of those shapes, teardrops, the pointy edge, or just a little bit of the round edge. So don't be afraid to experiment a little bit. And then the only other thing I'm going to tell you is that try not to, that was a really big seed. I'm going to try to go a little smaller. Try not to make everything even and uniform. Because we naturally seek out patterns. So what I recommend is just kind of shaking it up a little bit here, a little bit there. I'm going to do this on both sides. Little teardrops. Give everybody just a second to catch up here. My husband is cooking pizza right now, and it smells like there's a fire in the house. So I'm going to go ahead and trust that there is not a fire. But if all of a sudden you hear me yelling and screaming and running out of the house, that's what happens. All right, so we've done seeds. Now the next thing I'm going to do, we're just going to kind of add some finishing touches. And I'm going to go back to this, and you can see how the wet on wet technique has kind of started to blend and mix. It's a really cool technique. All right. Anyway, now what we're going to do is I'm going to dip my brush in water. I've just got clean water on my brush, and I'm going to come back down here and I'm going to re-wet some of this, and I am just going to fill in that space that we left earlier. I'm just going to move this kind of back and forth just to get the lightest tone. It's going to lift some of that watercolor and it's going to blend in that space. So clean water. Once it dries, it just lifts ever so slightly when we re-wet it. And it's just going to fill in some of that subtle color that we want down here by the rind. And then I'm going to dip back into my watermelon color. And I'm going to come back over here, right where the edge is, where we bit into it. We're pretending we bit into this watermelon. And I'm just going to add a little bit of that watermelon color. And I might even just add the tiniest bit of black into some of that, just to darken it, just a pinch. And add that here. Be careful with that black. We don't want this to turn black. We just want to add a little extra variation there. So we want that edge of the watermelon to look nice and juicy. And you can do that over here as well if you just want to. Sometimes the edges where we cut the watermelon is just a little more juicy than the rest. So you can add in just a little bit. And that is pretty much it for the watermelon itself. Now, of course, if you want to, you can add a drip here and there, maybe a little watermelon pool down here. And what I did on my sample is I just added a little bit of gray on here. I didn't tell you to have gray, so it's totally optional. But if you've got some gray, I water it down a lot, and then I just kind of want to create the illusion of a table. I'm going to try not to touch my actual watermelon when I do this so that my colors don't blend in there. And less is more when you're doing something like this, right? We just want kind of that illusion that it's sitting on something. So it's totally okay to play with it. Have fun. Try out new ideas. There's no right or wrong. And then another option, and you want to do this when it's completely dry, is if you happen to have a white gel pen, you can come through and just add kind of a little highlight on some of these areas, and it might help to make it look a little wet. This is optional. I didn't put it in the supply list. But sometimes just a little wet highlight here and there helps it to look like it's wet. And that is it for our watermelon wedges. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do the exact same process, except I am going to do it on I don't even know what you call it. I guess this is a wedge. It's just a different kind of wedge, right? It's just cut the long way instead of the other way. I don't know what you call it. If you know what that's called, go ahead and throw that in the chat. All right, so same process. I'm going to mix up some more paint because I know I don't quite have enough. So I'm going to create a green with blue and yellow because I like to mix my colors as much as possible. But there's no right or wrong, so if you just wanted to snag some of your green, if you've got a green, go for it. I won't judge you. All right, so we're gonna start off with a nice strong green, and then I'm gonna have some yellow prepared to tap in. All right, so this time we are gonna do a nice semicircle for our watermelon. And so in this case, I'm kind of going in one direction and then going back in the other. And I'm not too worried about whether or not this is a perfect circle, because if you've ever seen a real watermelon, they're lumpy and weird. All right, so there is my rind. Next thing I'm going to do is take clean water, and then I'm going to do a nice semicircle all the way around. And if your water runs out on your brush, just dip in and get some more. The idea here is just to get this green to blend out and make this rind a lot bigger. All right, so I've got my rind here. I'm going to come back in with some yellow, tap in some yellow. If you're feeling froggy, you could even tap in a darker green. Whatever you want to do. We're having fun. My favorite thing about watercolors is that it has a mind of its own. So sometimes I just like to play. Watercolor is one of those things that just makes it's one of those mediums where you can just get in the flow and not worry too much about what you're doing, because it's gonna do what it wants to do. It's kind of like controlled chaos. And some people are really good at working with watercolor and controlling that chaos. And other people really just kind of let it do its thing, and it's more abstract, and both ways are perfectly fine. All right, so this time I'm gonna mix up my watermelon color. I might go a little more pink, just to have a little more playful version. We'll go bright pink for this one. But of course, use whatever color you like. All right, now for this, I'm working a lot larger, so I'm gonna have to work quickly, and I'm gonna have to reapply this paint more than once. So what I'm gonna do is just kind of make a choppy line across with my watercolor in my pink. So whether you're using pink or red. All right, so I'm gonna add this right onto dry, just like we did earlier. I'm going to get probably about a 1-inch strip here. Of course, that's going to depend on the size of your paper. All right, so we've got our 1-inch watercolor. Now this is where, if you have a larger brush, you could switch to a larger brush. I'm just going to stick with my round, and I'm going to dip in water, clean water. And I'm just going to encourage this to move downward. So I'm going to create my wet down here. We're doing wet. I'm going to brush it downward, but I'm not going to touch that rind, because green and red do not make a pretty color. It makes brown, it makes mud. And then I'm just going to encourage this. Downward. And this is where I say you might need to just go kind of quick and heavy with that pigment. Add more pigment in if you need to. But the beauty of this is that it's going to move downward, and it's going to blend out beautifully. I ran out of paint, so I'm just going to mix a little more here. Remember, we want the top edge of this watercolor to be nice and saturated, and we are gonna encourage it to flow downward, and we want the bottom to be almost clear. So I'm gonna encourage this about halfway. And then I can come back through with that water again and push some water upward just to make sure that it's moving and blending. When we work in larger patches like this, it's a little more difficult, but it is the same technique we did for the wedges. Sometimes you just have to tell it where to go. All right, now I'm fairly satisfied with that, so I am going to go ahead and dry this. And while we are drying, I will mention, if you're not working sometimes you can tape your edges down. I like to use painter's tape, and that helps keep everything nice and snug. But sometimes the paper will warp, and that is caused by the paper drying differently in different areas. So sometimes, just to get that back to being flat, you can dry the underside. My paper today isn't too warped, but if you find your corners peeling up or your paper warping, that is just caused by the different drying times in different parts of the paper. And another really easy solution is when it's dry to the touch, you can just put a book on top of it or something heavy. But I find that just drying the back side helps as well. Kind of a little trick of the trade. All right, so this is mostly dry. Now what we're gonna do is the green of the rind. So just like with this first set here, I'm gonna add a nice green. Since I'm working a little larger, I'm going to stick with my large paintbrush, and I just go right over that edge. This one got really nice blend, and actually this one, after it's been drying for a few minutes, you can see some of that here too. It's got kind of those kind of crept out a little bit. I really like that. All right, so we've got our rind there. Next I'm going to do my seeds. You're going to have more seeds in the center than you are over here at the edges, and just make sure they are not even and perfect. All right, so we did our seeds, and now I am going to blend out the rind. So same as earlier, I've just got wet water, of course water is wet. I've just got clean water on my brush, and I'm just kind of filling this gap in between the pink and the green. And you can brush it out a little bit. Depending on the watercolors that you're using, some will lift easier than others. But I just want to make sure I touch a little bit of that green and touch a little bit of that pink. And it will handle the rest all on its own. And then we're going to do finishing touches. We're just going to add a little more color up here at the edge. When you cut a watermelon, that's where it's the juiciest. Don't be afraid to, tap in color wherever you want. Another fun effect that you can do, that I'll do with this larger watermelon, is you can just tap in some water, and it'll kind of move the color that's dried out a little bit. So I'll show you what that looks like. But other than that, that's pretty much it. If you want to add a little shadow, I just water down some gray. If you water down black a lot, you'll get a gray as well. And then just maybe throw a little shadow down here if you want to. But these watermelons are super fun. They are super easy to do. They make really fun cards. So if you've got watercolor paper, you can always fold it in half. You can cut it to size. You could write happy summer, happy birthday. You can make invitations to a cookout. I really love watermelon, and I love watercolor, and I love watercolor watermelon. So that's pretty much it, guys. I am so glad you guys joined me. I am playing with watercolor all month on my page. So let me give you, I will put in my YouTube link if you are interested. Let me find my link. Where did it go? I have to do this the funny way because I broadcast with StreamYard, and it doesn't always let me post links. So give me just a second. All right, here is my link. I'm going to put that on Facebook. There we go. So that's my YouTube link. I would love it if y'all would follow me on YouTube. As a small business owner, it's super helpful to have more followers. And if you want to play with watercolors with me all month, that's where you can find all my tutorials and fun demos. So I would love for you to follow me. I appreciate you guys joining me tonight. I really hope you guys will post your watermelon in the group and show everybody what you made. And or if you're following me on YouTube, you can always just tag me at Painted Cicada if you post on Facebook or Insta, and I'd love to see it. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Sue. Thanks, Selena. Have a good night.